Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome Ron Smith to the Talent Equation podcast. Long overdue. We've been trying to make this one happen for a while, ever since I listened to Ron talk at a conference, technology conference over in London. Ron, welcome.
Thank you, Stu. Pleasure to be here.
Great stuff. Well, as a starting point, I like I said, we've sort of been back and forward and had various conversations over the years, but it might just be worth telling everybody your kind of backstory and where you've come from.
Okay. Well, I was born in London. I grew up wanting to be a Spurs player and was destined for a career in professional football, in my opinion, and some others, but that didn't happen. I went into teaching, played football at a semi-professional level. At college, I met my first coach, and that got me on the coaching pathway. I did my full badge in England when I was 24. And I got my first full-time coaching job at 25 in Australia, funnily enough. And I've been coaching at various levels of the game ever since. I've worked with young players and youth players. I spent 15 years at the Institute of Sport in Canberra, which was a program designed for our sort of national youth team. And I was head coach there for 10 years. I worked in Asia in football. I've worked in the professional football, that is. I've also been a national coaching director, AFC instructor, and so on. And I recently did a research PhD in goal scoring patterns. And now I'm kind of semi-retired, and I'm thinking more and more about how to practice. So, as a quick sum up.
Wow, what a career! Just take me back to the stuff that you would when you said you were a national coaching director. Where were you doing that work?
In Malaysia.
Okay.
I spent 4 years working in clubs, and people at the Football Association knew my background in Coach Ed, which I started back in '75, and they wanted me to set up a whole new kind of structure and be involved and responsible for coach education in the country. And so I was kind of seconded from club football to go to work at the Football Association, which I did.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. And I imagine that was back then. I imagine that was very much in its infancy, and there was an awful lot of challenges trying to sort of transform coaching in that space.
Actually, the coaching was quite advanced because I actually followed Dick Bate.
Uh-huh.
Dick Bate had been the director of coaching in Malaysia for 3-4 years and went back to the FA in England. But the thing was, they wanted me to revamp the youth development side of the game because I won't go into detail, but it was fairly unstructured, so to speak. And the idea of being able to identify and develop talent wasn't really happening. So I instituted programs and talent ID based on what we'd done in Australia in setting up kind of like state-based programs, and with a national program at Bukit Jalil where the Commonwealth Games were held in '98. So, and that's still there. It's still going.
Great.
I'm pleased. Yeah.
So one of the reasons we've sort of jumped on this call is we, as usual, began. You I think began quite an extensive Twitter debate that might even still be running. But it'd be worth just sort of, I guess, walking the audience through what we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks, and then we can maybe delve into it in some more detail.
Sure. Well, I think one of the big debates is about isolated practice and, if you like, game-based learning, teaching game for understanding, and so on. And one of the things that I've always believed is that it's very hard to play games unless there's an element of technical competence to allow the game to go ahead with any kind of meaning or resemblance of what happens in a proper game. And often to do that, I think young players need to have a level of competence before they can get into a game. And that's not to say that, kids don't play games, but when I grew up as a youngster, I basically learned techniques and that from playing in the street and in the park. And I never played a game of football until I was in my last year at primary school. But when I did, I was actually quite competent. I could pass and receive a ball, run with it. I could beat people. I could take corner kicks and all that sort of stuff. So I look back to what, and I wasn't the exception. This is what happened to everybody. And so I sort of think that maybe because society's changed and the approach to getting young players into a sport at a young age, particularly in a country like Australia where you've got massive competition from other football codes, we're kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit and putting kids into game situations when in effect the game doesn't look anything like a real game. It's little more than I'll kick it in that direction and you kick it back. And so how do they learn? Well, for me, they need to learn the actual techniques in a play environment or on their own or however they want to do it away from the game. And I think there's enough evidence to show that just playing games doesn't allow anywhere near enough repetition, even at slightly older ages and with a higher level of competence, for real learning and refinement to take place. And I would certainly concur with that, having spent 10 years working with youth international players, that, whilst you're working on their game understanding and how to be effective in a game, you still need to refine technique through good doses of repetition with a bit of feedback.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of an intro.
There's a lot in there. I suppose a couple of things that we probably need to unpick or probably define is when you talk about a game, I'm assuming you're talking about the kind of full match, sort of, 11 on 11 type match.
Not necessarily. We have in this country at half time, we have like little pickup games with tiny little goals, and the kids go out there.
Yeah.
And they play five-a-side, on an area that's about 30 yards long and 30 yards wide or whatever it is. But you can see, what sort of level some of the kids are at. And it certainly doesn't involve passing and receiving very much. It's very much a case of, well, when I get it, I'm going to try and sort of run with it, which is not uncommon, even running in the wrong direction. And so you see that. And through my own kids playing sport, I've seen the same thing evolve. So it's not, I'm not talking necessarily about the big picture. I'm talking about even small-sided games.
And so are you therefore saying that in the small-sided games, you still don't feel there's enough repetition to be able to hone technique?
No, because I don't think at the real basic level, and that's what we're talking about, and a little bit above it, I don't think they actually get, they get a lot more repetition, yes, but I don't think it's the right environment for actual learning to take place. Great for fun, and, I would let the kids play games. I wouldn't be a showstopper like that. But I'm just looking at it clinically and stepping back from it. And I think there are far more engaging ways of teaching young players how to run with the ball, stop and start, change direction, which are all the kind of, for me, the the prerequisites to be able to manipulate the ball and keep control of it, so that eventually you can actually look away from the ball, and then you can say, well, if you can see someone, can you pass it? And often, just passing the ball is not that difficult. But it's actually being at a level where you can take your eyes off the ball long enough to actually see someone to pass it to. And I just think that working in some isolation with, a number of challenges in a cognitive sense helps develop that, as well as playing a game for fun.
Tell me more about what you mean when you say a number of challenges in a cognitive sense.
That let's take just running with the ball, for example. If you look at young players develop, what they do is their centre of focus is always on the ball. And I think that's because of uncertainty. They don't quite know what's going to happen with it. And so the early stages for me in trying to teach this will be to say to players, well, can you actually control, just stop for a minute. Can you move the ball and manipulate it and roll it with the sole of your foot and change feet without actually looking at the ball? Can you look, almost like 2 or 3 yards ahead of the ball, but you can still see it? I actually used to say out the bottom of your eyes kind of thing, without actually looking directly at the ball. Yeah. And now can you try and do that and run with it? So and that is so hard to do in a game because there's always somebody trying to kick the ball off you. And then introduce things like, if I blow the whistle, can you put your foot on this and stop the ball as quickly as possible, or change direction? If I say, look at me, can you still manage to control the ball and actually look to see where I am and then still have the ball under control? Because often what happens is, the learner, I wouldn't necessarily the young player, the learner will look away and then come back to, oh, where's the ball gone? So it's in that kind of context. And I think if you can help develop those and then go into the game again and see if there's improvement. But I don't really see opportunities to do that with real beginners in a small-sided game. So
I suppose the debate here, or the discussion here is, and it's interesting because I definitely feel as if there's almost like sort of two sides, and I think it feels to me like you're sort of somewhere in the middle. I mean, in the sense that, you definitely from your own development see the benefits of skills emerging from, that kind of street stroke
yep.
backyard type game, and technique emerging from there. But what you're saying is that there's still a requirement or still space for, or a need for that kind of individual sort of, time on ball, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, as a means by which to improve the individual's ability to manipulate that ball. Is that sort of a summary of what you're saying?
Yeah, it would be. And I also think, Stu, that when you see young players, and this is one of the problems of putting kids in age groups, you can go and watch, an under 7 or under 8 small-sided game, but you'll see 1 or 2 players in there who have really had 2 years more practice. So because we don't know the environment that they've grown up in, they may have been playing around with the ball, for 3 or 4 years, but it stands out, and people then go, oh, he's a natural, he's gifted or whatever. When in actual fact, he's probably got older brothers and that, and he's played with. And so he's learnt to manipulate the ball and whatnot to the point where we used to use the term in a coaching sense of beating legs. So when you run with the ball and your head's down a little bit, even if it's just a little bit further ahead of the ball, the first thing you see is a pair of legs. And so you learn after a while, okay, I'll beat the legs. And it's not uncommon to see kids in a kind of little game where they'll beat legs one way, then they'll go and they'll finish up sometimes actually almost going back towards their own goal. And then they'll reorientate themselves and head in the right direction. But all they're doing in actual fact is they're being confronted by another pair of legs, and so they evade them. And whereas other players, they're not at that level. And that's one of the problems, I think, with age grouping. And I really think that we ought to put young players on ability levels rather than age levels, for those reasons. That, if you see young players who have got to the point where they can receive a ball and they look to pass to somebody, if they give it to someone who's not at the same level, they know they're going to lose it. Often in games, kids won't actually pass the ball. They'll pass it to someone who they know is going to keep it. Yeah. In a way, I think it's kind of like human nature. I've actually observed purposely and gone to see how many times in an under 10 or under 11 game on a big pitch, and this was years ago when I did this, how many kids actually pass to each other in the game. And it wasn't uncommon to see a nucleus of 4 or 5 lads who would continually pass the ball to each other, and they were the better players in the team. And unfortunately, some lads would play in the game and would barely touch the ball. You could count on one hand how many actual ball contacts they had. But they'd come off and say, "Wow, that was great. I really enjoyed playing in that," because it's being part of the team, and so on. But I think the tendency would be, as time goes on, unless those lads who are having minimal contact actually start to improve and get contact, they're the ones most likely to say, "You know what, I don't enjoy this too much anymore because I'm kind of like not really involved." Yeah. I've got no evidence to prove that or anything, but I think it just logically it kind of makes sense.
I think the interesting thing about this, I suppose, is that, and for me, is sort of which way. It's a bit of a chicken and egg argument, I think. So, which way does it work? Does it work that in order to play the game effectively, we need to have technique, which we can then apply in the game? And what we're mainly discussing here is what is, I suppose, the most effective, or one of, or what is an effective way of developing skill. Now, my view, and based it on a lot of the work that's going on around this ecological approach, is that skill emerges from an adaptation to a problem that the game presents, and you've just mentioned it there. Beating legs.
Yep.
And the problem I have is with the isolation stuff. And by the way, I'm not against isolated practice, but I'll come back to that later. Is the problem is that I think sometimes when we do isolated practice, we haven't got the legs. The legs aren't there. So you might learn an evasion move, but that evasion move isn't the same move as when the legs are there, because those legs are going to move as well. So your evasion move might have to be an evasion move with another evasion move and another evasion move, depending on what the legs do. So my view is that in terms of repetition, I would like my players to see as much repetition of the evasion move, but in context of those other legs that are in the way.
Yeah. Okay, I get it.
And because otherwise I feel as if they're learning something that sort of resembles what they might have to do in the game, but then the minute a defender does something different, you're like, what do I do now? And it breaks down, and then we go back to what we knew before.
Okay, then, I don't have a problem with that logic, Stu. All I would say is that getting to the point where you can actually beat legs, involves being able to get your head up to a degree where you're not desperately concerned about losing control of the ball, because you can actually still do that.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing about when a player is totally focused on receiving a pass. Unless they can actually take their eyes off the ball, it's pointless saying pass it to somebody, because they won't know who to pass to. They won't even see them. Their focus will be solely on the ball. So I think, I was coaching in Iceland one year. I'll just do this as a little example. And I had to take a group of kids in a school hall, and I couldn't speak to them. Okay, because I didn't speak Icelandic. Not many of them spoke any English. And so I very quickly thought on my feet, and I had kids everywhere trying to run with the ball and pass it and, avoid each other and so on. But they're actually doing things in pairs, but in a completely changing kind of environment. And one of the things I said was, and I may have had a translator as well, but I said, right, when you pass it to your partner, you have to give them a signal about where they're going to take the ball. And so you put your arm out to the left or your right arm out to the right after you've kicked it. And when you think about this, so even in a very simple little thing like this, the player, if he hasn't got a look for a signal, all he'll do is look at the ball because you don't have to look at anything else. And so I did this with these kids, and I've done it heaps of times since. And then you start playing around and say, well, how late can you leave the signal? And yet the person who's going to receive the ball is waiting and waiting and waiting. So they have to keep looking up and down at you and at the ball and at you and at the ball to see, do I move it to the left or do I move it to the right with my first touch? Yeah. So again, that's another way of trying to get that basic behaviour of being able to actually take your eyes off the ball. Now, if you were then say, okay, we're now going to play a little 3v1 or 4v1 possession, they will at least be, at least now they can actually look up and maybe have to look to the side now to be able to go to that next step. And that's all I'm saying is that if you look at the requirements of a player, then what is it that they need to be able to take the next step? And if they can't do that, and there's people trying to get the ball off them, most of the time I think they're going to lose the ball, purely and simply for that reason.
I suppose the thing there, though, is that that's true. However, how do you know, or how do we know as coaches, that what we're going to teach them in terms of their method of whether it's eliminating or passing is the right method?
Well, I think it's a basic tool. I look at techniques, Stu, as a basic tool to play the game.
Yeah.
And we need some certain tools to be able to then decide how we're going to use them.
Yeah.
And that, for me, then is where the real decision making come in. But if I don't, I guess in some ways it's trying to speed up the process of being able to get some of these basic tools to a level where we can then actually have a lot more fun and actually play the game more. And with a little bit more success of being able to actually make a pass to somebody because I can actually take my eyes off the ball now and do it. And so that's my thinking behind trying to fast track that little bit rather than try and do everything like in the game, where you've got a lot more pressure to deal with. I guess that's really summing up what my belief is about the need for your technique.
So the way I manage it, because sort of the way I view skill is a technique that's applied in a context.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so my thinking is I kind of work backwards from the context. So rather than technique in, it's context out. So What I do is in order to, your point is really good, which is, if there's too much kind of pressure, there's too much chaos, then the technique doesn't accurately kind of emerge because they're just coping, aren't they? So they're not going to do these different things because there's someone they've taken it away. So the way I would do that is I'd still retain the essence of the game or the essence of the contest, i.e. the other person who is going to try and do something to stop me from achieving my objective, whatever that might be. But what I'll do is I will manipulate the rules of that game, or manipulate the space that they're involved in, or, manipulate how many players there are, or manipulate how much the players can move in order to be able to dial down the level of pressure. But what I'd try and avoid doing, I'm not saying I'd never do, but what I try and avoid doing is taking away the opponent altogether.
All right. Okay. All right. I get that. and for me, that's fine. If you want to do it that way, I can understand the logic behind that. I just think that there's nothing wrong with either approach if the players have an opportunity. The only thing I would say is that in kind of if you're in small environments, which is what I'm kind of picturing from what you've just said, so you may only have three players sort of like in a little practice. You can actually then stop that and say, what can you look at, or where can you look so that you can actually see quite easily the defender, the passer, and the ball. And is that the sort of thing that you might do? Whereas I might say, look, I can ask somebody a question or make a point to a group and just say, look, have a go at this and try that and see if you find that easier. For example, like keep looking at the player as long as possible and have quick little looks at the ball. But don't look at the ball all the time. Your focus has got to be on the other player kind of thing. So I'm thinking more, not so much in those really small practices. I'm thinking about in the 5v5 kind of scenario as the game. So I think what you've just described is kind of like a step up from what I've been talking about in the context of getting someone to lift their eyes off the ball, either by running with it or whatever. So I don't think we're too far apart there.
Yeah, I mean, it as you said there as well, it comes back to how we define a game. So for me, when I talk, you hear me talk a lot about drills and things like that. So what I'm trying to say to everybody is, this idea of, kids dribbling around cones or, kind of just doing these sort of fairly repetitive movements that don't really have any opponent involved. I'm sort of saying, well, look, if we can gamify that somehow, by adding in some, kind of a fun challenge, how many can you do in a period of time, or how many can we all do together, or or even ideally, put somebody in there who's going to try and stop you from doing it, then immediately we've made it more engaging, so it's more fun and it's more like what kids want to do. And then secondly, they are then developing the skill, but they're doing it in direct relation to a more realistic environment. And I'm always trying. But one thing I will say though, and I think this is a point you made earlier, which is really, really accurate one, is it does take longer. And my kids are less technically adept than some of the other kids we play against. And that is a direct consequence of the fact that I've made a deliberate choice not to essentially go, here's a technique, here's a technique, here's a technique. And the reason for that is, I want them to develop the technique as a solution to the problem that they face in the game. And what I'm finding is really interesting is some of the novel techniques that they create. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Look how that individual decided to solve that problem. That's not something I would have taught them.
Yeah. Okay. Just going back a step there, Stu. Last week, I was actually with a friend of mine and we were experimenting with running with the ball activity. Mm-hmm. And what we did, we had like a zone where they had to pass the ball through but they weren't allowed to touch it in there. So they had to wait their pass for the ball to go to a certain area and then go after it and then approach a defender who actually had to stand with both feet astride a cone. And the challenge for the player with the ball was to run towards him and see how close he could get, all right, before trying to evade the legs or beat the legs, so to speak. Yeah. Now, the boys who were doing this had the ability to actually look beyond the ball.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the challenge for them was, how close dare you go? Because, and the defender had one limit on him. He had to keep one foot on the ground and move one leg. He could reach out as far as he wanted to try and get the ball. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning, he could only move one leg. Mm. So he couldn't come after you with two steps.
Yeah.
So the guy going with the ball, it was a challenge then. How brave are you and how close can you get? And are you going to wait until he has a strike at the ball before you move it? Or, are you going to do it before? So they had lots of freedom to make a choice. And also which side they went, all these things. And it was really quite interesting to see how some of them weren't going to go close at all.
Yeah.
And probably because they weren't confident enough. But, anyway, we played around with that as an idea. Yeah. And so, I think that's kind of limiting how much information they've got to process.
Yeah.
While they're trying to develop the ability of actually getting a little bit closer, but how close do I go and when do I change direction and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
For me, that would be a good precursor to saying, okay, well, let's have a little game now where, I want to see if you can beat someone before you score. One of you. It doesn't have to be everybody, but one of you actually tries to beat a defender, for example. And that for me is at the lower or the beginner levels. You're starting to get a little bit more competency in being able to, do things without always having to focus on the ball.
Yeah, exactly. And what you've done there is what I describe as sort of, I call this thing I call the funnel of variability, which is you've taken away a lot of the things that could happen. You've constrained the defender in such a way that they can only do certain things, and that therefore means that the player with the ball has less things that they have to attend to. And because they've got less pieces of information they have to deal with, you can sort of zone them in on just the action that you want them to try and develop. And that's what they refer to as this repetition without repetition, because that defender can do different things.
Yeah.
They're
yes,
obviously
that's right.
constrained, but they don't have to do the same thing each time, and the player still has to react to what that defender does in order to be able to successfully evade, don't they?
Yeah. Now, in some respects, you could say that's taken. Is that an isolated practice, or is it a technique practice? Now, in terms of definition, I wouldn't say that was an isolated practice.
No,
I would say that is, if you like, a technique practice, but at its most basic level. And for the reasons you've just said, you're putting some constraints in there that are going to limit what the defender can do and how much information the attacker has to deal with. A step for me on that then, to make it even more realistic, would be to say, if you want, you can play a wall pass with somebody on the side.
Yeah.
So I'd kind of build that into the picture then. So they've got, okay, so now I can decide, how close I go and I might even ask, what you probably see then is people dummying to make a pass and not making it, but dragging the ball away, So there's that kind of development of, how much information you have to process. And I guess that's very much where I come from as a coach, because I believe, at the more advanced levels, the game essentially is about reading cues. Mm-hmm. And I often liken teaching people to play football to learning how to drive a car. Mm. I think there are great similarities.
Yeah.
You have some, like if, I taught both my sons to drive, and the first thing I did was to put them in a completely non-threatening situation and say, the most important thing is you know how to start and stop.
Yeah.
Because if you're not sure how to stop, we're going to be in trouble sooner or later.
Yeah.
And obviously, driving a car, you've got the risk of injury and stuff like that. But to draw the analogy, I see that in a football sense, you need to be able to pass and receive and run with the ball and actually do it without looking at the ball, in the same way that you learn to stop a car without looking at the pedals.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the problem when we do these sort of decontextualized practices. So what you described there is that little, I describe that as a game because, there is an opponent to beat. So it's a game. Now it's a constrained game, but it's still a game form. And like you say, it is developing a particular action. It's not necessarily a tactical thing, is it? Because you're not necessarily developing the action based on what your other teammates or what the opponents might be doing. But there is an individual opponent there that you've got to try and do something to get past. So for me, that is absolutely going to be looking at developing football actions. You're not pre-prescribing what those football actions are. You're not saying, we're going to learn a step over, we're going to learn this, we're going to learn that. You're just allowing the player to experiment with different ways of kind of eliminating that individual. So like you say, that's definitely not an isolated practice. What I think the mistake a lot of people make is that, so they go from there straight to, say, a 5v5. Now, for me, the next progression in terms of a game might be a 2v2 after what you've done there, because or even a 1v1, because then there's no constraint on the defender. Can we still do the same things that we've worked on with a constrained defender, when the defender has more freedom? Can we still make those kinds of actions? Can we still explore those actions? Then maybe you might bring in another participant, as in a 2v1 or a 2v2, because then you've got other things to attend to, i.e. I've got a friend I could pass to, he's got someone he's going to be marking him, or she's got someone who's marking her, and actually that's how we kind of bring the challenge up. But what a lot of people do is they sort of step over that, so they'll do that that constrained practice you've described. Even worse, actually, what they'll do is they'll do something with no opponent, so that all their focus is on the ball. Then they'll chuck them straight into the chaos of the 5v5, and all of a sudden it's like, why aren't you doing what we just practiced?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the overload's enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is, Stu, when I said in the intro about spending a lot more time looking at practice, I mean, I haven't just done this, but I'm talking about putting limits on people. Even if you introduce like a second defender in there, you might say, well, you've got to start on that line at the end of the grid that they're trying to get past. And you can't become active until they've actually gone past the first defender, because that then takes the pressure off. If you give the second defender open slather right from the word go, they might actually come and stand right behind the defender that they've got to get past in the first instance. So you can actually introduce how much effect the second defender might have in that practice by putting a few little conditions or constraints on them. Just like, well, you can start here, or now we'll bring you a bit further forward, so you can start here, which means if you play a wall pass or you dribble round, you're going to have a little bit less time now before the second defender confronts you.
Yeah.
I'll come back to the practice bit maybe later, about views I've had about transfer of training and the value of certain ways of practicing. I'd like your thoughts on that, and sort of share with you what I've been doing the last 3-4 years that I didn't do for the previous 35, by the way. And so I kind of say, how stupid am I? It's taken me all this time, to sort of see the light in terms of making it highly transferable into the game. So anyway, we'll talk about that one a little bit later, maybe, if we have time.
Well, actually, it's because I'm a big believer in the conversation being emergent, and we've segued into it. Let's go into that space.
All right, then. Okay. Well, I'll give you an example. For years, I've done what are typically called probably rondos or box practices, and I'm going right away from them now. In fact, I can see how they have unconsciously developed really bad habits for players when they go into the game. And I'll give you a quick example. Let's say you've got a 4v2 in a grid, and one of the ways of solving the problem of keeping possession is to play the ball between two defenders. So what happens is you actually play to someone who nearly always is facing you dead square on. So I look up and I see it and I go, boof, and because I can, the space is between them, and I do it. And then in a game, and this is what I actually observed that made me kind of like come down this pathway, I would see in a game a player give the ball to someone in the middle of the park who's got his back to goal, and he's got other passing options to the side where people are side on and could actually go forwards with it. And I say to myself, why would you do that? Now, I come back to then, so what are you doing in practice? And I've observed this behaviour very much either as warm-ups or part of the training session. where people do this in fairly tight areas. And I've done it all myself. Don't get me wrong. And then I realised that in those practices, you actually don't have to scan for anything, because invariably you can see everyone in there. But then you put that in the game. What I've done is I've trained you every day not to scan. And so then I go in a game, and now I expect you to be looking over your shoulder, and it doesn't happen as often as you think. And so I've said to myself, well, what would happen then if I had that practice and I had other people outside the grid who could come in and defend when the ball goes between the two in the square? So can you see the picture I'm trying to describe?
Yeah.
You know, have another player.
Yeah.
And I started doing this. I made the areas a bit bigger. And then I said, okay, so let's say we've got a 4v2 and there's two other defenders outside. So at any time when the ball goes between the two in the middle, one of the other two can come in and try and win the ball. And if the players inside are not switched on, the defender will come in and nick it really quickly, because they start to anticipate he's going to play that. And that's why you have to make the areas a little bit bigger. So that was the first one. And I've tried doing that. And it's been really interesting then to see the players actually scanning, you know, the smarter ones, the ones that get it. The players inside playing the four attackers, they're constantly looking to see where the other defenders are, because they know they're liable to come in and ambush them if the ball goes between the two inside. So that, you know, that was the starting point. And then I said to myself, what does this do for defenders? The two defenders in there. In my opinion, it does nothing. Because they don't know actually what they're defending. They haven't got there's no direction. And so we're reinforcing maybe defenders chasing the ball. And then in the game we say, I want you to track runners. But I'm training you every day not to do that in this practice. So you see where my thinking's going about the transfer into the game. So I've gone away from those sorts of practices now and put direction in. So I've got people outside, okay, but they're on the side of the grid where the direction is the attackers are going. And they have to move from one area into another area and recreate 4 against 2 and leave one defender in the other end. And then you can expand it to go, well, I can have one attacker, one defender in the other end and 4v2 in here. You can make, you know, and so on. And so in terms of a 4v2 practice, it's actually becoming a 4v3, but with a few little constraints in there. I don't call them constraints. I'll call them rules, you know, about what you can do and when you can do it. And it influences the behaviour of the players in the practice. And I've found it so much better than just doing sort of standard box practices. Now, this brings another point in, Stu. I would do that with any players for relevance, okay? Because I still think that you're in danger of reinforcing bad behaviours, if you believe they're bad behaviours, in a practice that might carry over into the game. From a learning perspective, I think it's really good, because you're not putting learner players under too much pressure. You're giving them a numerical advantage. And in the early days, I might say, well, you've got another attacker in that other end. He's not a defender yet. So it's actually 5 against 2, you know. So you can play around with the numbers down at the other end. And it's great for when you've got young kids who keep coming in dribs and drabs. So if you're working with young'uns, as you said earlier, I bet you'll find, you know, you'll get a certain number and you'll have a practice, and then, in comes another one. And they join in straight away. And so I found this to be a really good way of accommodating kids who are at the mercy of their parents as to whether they're on time or not. You know, and it's not their fault. So I don't think it's fair to punish kids if they turn up, you know, 5 minutes late or whatever. I found this to be a really good way to help not only me cope, because it used to do my head in, I tell you, but to manage the numbers and the problems that a lot of coaches probably have at everyday training. oh, I've got an 8 and a 7. I want 2 groups. I want to get some more repetition, but I haven't got an even split.
Yeah.
So doing that sort of thing gives you really great flexibility of how you want to manipulate numbers. Once you understand, obviously, the kind of the elements of the practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah. A guy at the FA actually works in the PE unit at the FA. A guy called Vinny Halsall taught me. I coached cricket with him in the summer, and he taught me a really good thing he calls them arrival games, where the numbers don't necessarily matter too much, so that it allows everybody to come in, like you say, in the dribs and jabs, but they're still doing something active that's in relation to your activity. And actually that's been really useful for me, because a bit like you, I mean, the amount of times, you've just got it going and you've got your numbers right and everything's set up, and then about 5 arrive and you've got to somehow accommodate them. It's like, So I found that to be really useful.
Yeah. No, I did. And the other thing is, what I'm experimenting now a little bit is making areas bigger rather than smaller. Because when you actually look at the game, there are periods where things get really tight, but then they're usually not very long and people get out of them. Yeah. They normally go either forwards up the park and over the traffic, so to speak, or they'll come back, switch the play, so they don't have to play through a really congested area. And so I'm saying to myself, well, you can still have congestion, but allow people then to actually drop out of a grid. So if I'm jammed on the end line, but I want to support my mate on the ball, and I'm being pressured by another defender because he's read the script, we've got you here, we've pinned you in because there's that limit of the line behind you. I'm now starting to say, okay, well, you can drop out of there because that's what you do in the game. But the defender has to stay inside. You see what I mean? So that if I just want to play the ball across to somebody, and I'm going now for making areas a bit bigger than I would years ago, because I think it reflects a little bit more of the game. And then if you join a couple of practices together, it's almost like, okay, well, it's a smooth transition now. We're just playing a bigger game. Yeah. And that's what I've been working towards in recent years, for that transfer effect, not only for the attackers, but for the defenders as well. So they always know which way you're going, and which way they've got to defend, and how they then react, whether they're outnumbered or not.
Yeah, because I think often when you're playing in small areas, the assumption is by making it small, you have to be able to react quicker, and you've got to be able to, you've got less space to operate, so you're going to develop tighter, closer skills, but most people are only thinking about that from the attack's perspective. And like you say, the defenders, it's not, they don't really have much to do, and there's not really much of a consequence for loss of possession. So like you say, what you want, don't you, is defenders need to learn how to co-adapt in order to create congestion in a large area. And the secret of defending is to make that, as Johan Cruyff used to say, make the pitch small for them. But it actually takes quite a lot of coordination to do that, and if one person doesn't do it quite right, the attack can get out. So they have to learn how to do it together. It's almost like, it's like hunting in a pack, isn't it? They've got to learn how to close that space down, create the congestion, make it small so they can win possession. If you start in a naturally congested area, they never learn how to create the congestion and how to coordinate each other to make the congestion.
Yes, I agree. But I would have done more for different reasons. And I think this is a bit of a dilemma, Stu. People see top players. You can get videos and you can see Bayern Munich playing rondos, 8 or 9 against 2. And when you look at it really closely, when in the game do you keep making, 24 passes and nobody actually moves more than a metre? So you sort of go, well, so, that really has got no relevance to the game, in my opinion, because I've yet to see that ever happen. But it's a bit of fun. Yeah. And so why are they doing it? Well, they're just doing it to get a bit of a touch and a feel on the ball. Yeah. And you might say, look, okay, there's nothing wrong with fun, but be very clear in terms of what you expect to get from a practice, because you could do the same thing with a group of 10-year-olds, as you can do with full-time pros, but it's what comes out of the practice that's different, and it could just be in terms of the speed of the passing and one touch, and so on. And if you want learning to actually occur, then I would say, why would you do that with younger players who are very much in the learning kind of stages? When you see top pros do it, and they're just doing it because it's great to keep the 2 or 3 in the middle for as long as possible. It gives you bragging rights and all sorts.
Yeah.
And they are good fun games. But, I'm just saying that I think sometimes people lose the context of why they're doing it and what they're doing it for, and is that appropriate then for learners, so to speak.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say, Stu, is I'm in your camp. As soon as, if I had any players, okay, who can get their head up and pass and receive a ball and have got the ability to actually look for someone, for me then just do opposed games. Or I've been brought up not to think of them as opposed games, so to speak, technique practices where you've got overloads. I've got a hierarchy of control about practices that go from unopposed, and they've always been called drills. Mm-hmm. And this is also causes confusion, I think, sometimes, Stu, is our terminologies are different.
Yeah.
Some people drill as an activity that might have opposition or not. For me, I've always looked at drills or related practices. They are unopposed. Mm-hmm. And then the next level up could be a technique practice that involves a 2 against 1 scenario. But if I said to you a technique practice, there's opposition in there.
Yes.
However restrained it may be. But so in terms of understanding about what we're talking about, and then you go from the smaller picture up to, like football rounders or games like that, head tennis. They're a kind of a game that's still got technique in, but it's a game. You then go to things like, phase practice, small-sided games, a coach practice match, the full competitive match. So there's this kind of hierarchy of control of how you practice. So I think that sometimes, I often sort of say to people, when you talk about a drill, do you mean an unopposed practice, or do you mean that there could be a 4v2, for example? Yeah.
That's one of the things that I've been having to try and clear up is, when I say drill, what do I mean? And I do mean unopposed, repetitive. There's usually a queue of kids waiting to have their go. And it's just, and I still see it, and I'm like, it's just not really doing anybody any good whatsoever. So that I agree with you though. I do think we need to be clear about what we're talking about. One thing that I was going to talk about as well is that I think one of the things you were arguing for was to say, actually, there is time for the kind of what I call me and my ball time. Where there isn't an opposition necessarily, it's purely exploration or working on the manipulation of the ball. And for example, a lot of kids would do that in the garden. They spend a lot of time manipulating the ball, playing around with it, and this, that, and the other. What stimulated it was one of those videos that you get posted, don't you? There was a young man running around doing all these tricks and moves, and he's got some cones and he's moving around. Yeah. And everyone was saying, "Oh, look at these look at this great technique." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine," but a lot of us would question the value. Now, I'm not questioning the value of doing that kind of rehearsal activity, because there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I think for me, what I would almost prefer the young person to be doing though is to almost imagine they're up against somebody, imagine they're up against like the best defender in the world, so that they've at least got in their own heads some sort of context. Because when they're by themselves at home in the garden, there's no one to play with. So by all means, go out there and manipulate the ball. Do that. It's absolutely amazing. But again, try and make it realistic if you can, because then actually you're going to get a little bit more out of it. So when I see cones on the floor and you see people running, you just sort of think to yourself, "Oh, blimey."
Yeah. Okay. I can see where you're coming from that. I can give you an example. I had a young player who I'd seen playing against my own kids from about the age of 8, and it was in Canberra, and I'd been working at the AIS for some years, and I saw this young lad at the age of 14, and one day I actually brought him in on a scholarship because he lived about 300 metres from the AIS, and so he came in and joined us 2 years before he should have done, only because he lived round the corner. And in a football sense, you know, he was so advanced that he was on a different planet to kids his own age. So I brought him in with the likes of Craig Moore, John Aloisi, Mark Viduka, who I had as youth players at the time at the AIS.
Yeah.
And one day I said to him, I said, Joe, how have you developed your technical ability? Because he's the most two-sided player I've ever coached. And he said to me, he said, well, a couple of years ago, Ron, he said, my dad came home with a video, and he said, Joe, watch this. And he said, when you come home from school, he said, try and do what the bloke does. Put the video on the telly, stand in the lounge, and see if you can do all these moves. And Joe said, that's what I did. And when I could do everything with my right foot, my dad said, okay, now try and do it with your left foot. So Joe said, so I did it with my left foot. And I said, but what else did you do, Joe, in your sort of early days? And I'm talking probably 11, 12, around that time. And he said, I used to spend an awful lot of time in the garden making up challenges.
Yeah.
I said, okay, explain more. He said, when you can do something, let's say like juggling.
Yeah.
He said, if you juggle a ball 300 times, you could do it 1,000 times because it's just the same thing. And you get bored. So he said, I'd find different ways of actually juggling and getting the ball up. And he said, I'd do things like I'd have a size 4 that was soft. I'd have a size 4 that was blown up a bit more. I'd have a size 5 the same. And I'd try and do things with different kind of ball. And it could be like I'd kick it up against the garage wall, it'd come back, I'd flick it up and then volley it to try and knock a brick off the wall. You know, and it was some years later, I read the talent code. And as I was reading it, I was seeing Joe, who went on to play 108 games for Croatia, by the way.
Yeah.
Now, again, we talk about talent, you know, he could do all of these things in a game, but he actually learnt them in isolation.
Yeah. And
this is where I look back over my years of working with talented kids. Now, I'm not saying he only did that. He played games down the park. I know for a fact. You know, he said we used to play down there, Ronnie, until it got dark.
Yeah.
We'd ride down on our bikes, turn the bikes up. That was the goal. And then we'd play with anyone that wanted. It could be 8-a-side, it could be 16-a-side almost.
Yeah.
So there was this combination of practice for specific reason, and then, okay, I'm going to play games now. And that's when they put it into play. And I think going back to the video of the lad with the ball and the cones, I don't think people like that have a great problem in being able to say, oh, okay, I'll do it now. And because they're looking for information. You don't have to take your eyes off the ball when there's nothing to look for. But in a game, you do. You know, and young Joe was, he was just amazing in the way he then adapted with older players around him. And, you know, so I look at things like that and I say, well, and now he may have been the exception to the rule, Stuart. You know, I'm not saying every kid that does these things is going to become a top player, because obviously they don't. You know, we all know what the ratios are of young players to becoming almost like professional players. But he was somebody that technically I never had to do anything with. Yeah. All I had to get Joe to do was understand about when to do things and how to actually play with his teammates. You know, when to release the ball, because he could keep the ball all day if he wanted to.
It's interesting. It's
you know,
interesting,
that was
isn't it? His development. I can see how that would be the case, wouldn't it? Because like you say, a lot of his development is essentially in isolation. So of course, you then have to spend a lot of time getting him to take what he's learnt in isolation and apply it when he's got other people there. So to have that sort of be able to connect with others and understand that this move is a great thing to do here, but it might not be the best thing in relation to your teammates. And that's always the big challenge. I suppose it's that decision-making piece that so when I've got groups of players together, so, when they're on their own, by all means, work as hard as you can, get your do your ball manipulation and all that sort of stuff. But I've only got limited time with the kids that I'm coaching. So in my mind, what I'm saying is I want to make that as decision rich as possible, because otherwise they're not going to get the opportunity to, so I want them to get reps, but the reps are decisions or, movements in relation to others. Because otherwise they're not going to get very much of that, because there's no guarantee.
I agree with you. In the training context.
Yeah.
But I think the danger is that when people say, no, isolated practice, no, there's no point doing that. That's not good for you. I'm sorry, but I can't accept that. I think that is where you refine stuff. I mean, like every week at the AIS, we used to have a shootout to see who was going to take all the free kicks that might result in a goal.
Yeah.
We had 3-4 players in the team, all fancied their chances of scoring. And so before we had a match on the weekend, I'd say, okay, who's in the lottery? Who wants to go in? And they'd have a shootout. Whoever scored the most goals over our wall got the right to take the free kicks.
But that's super competitive. It's got layers of pressure. It'd be really good, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. But the other thing was they would go in there and practice from all different scenarios, okay, because you never quite knew where the free kick was going to be. Yeah. So they'd be practicing there, and some of them had quite different techniques of trying to do it. And over the years, when you're doing this on a regular basis every week and looking at different techniques of doing it, I used to practice with them. Yeah. In fact, I got quite good at it. In fact, when I was in my early 50s in Kuala Lumpur, where I was working, I made a video up about David Beckham's technique, and I analysed it, and I said to myself, well, if I think I can analyse a technique for someone to learn, I should be able to teach myself how to do it. And I was really disappointed in the early stages because I couldn't. even though, I mean, okay, so I was in my 50s. But I was, and after all the years of practicing dead ball free kicks at the AIS, I could do my way, but I couldn't do it Beckham's way. And then after a fair bit of frustration, I finally cracked it. And I started, okay, I could see myself as David Beckham taking these free kicks. The only resemblance there was that I had fair hair as well. But I actually got to a level of, and I was so excited. We were having these trials, okay, for the national program, and I had one of the keepers, and I kept going in for a little bouts of practice in between practice games, and I can recall it. It must have been about the 28th free kick I took. I tore me rectus femoris. So I got a real rude lesson that night, and I've still got a hole in my quads where that resulted. But I kind of felt pleased in a way that I actually had taught myself how to do it. But that came from an awful lot of isolated practice.
Yeah, what's interesting about that though is that, and it's this difference between practice, isn't it? Practice and learning. So for me, one of the reasons my focus tends to be on, contextualized, sort of training approaches is because I'm very interested in the players learning the game. I want them to learn what the game is asking them to do, as much as I possibly can. So I want to make that, go back to that point about being decision rich. Now, in order to become better, what they might need to do is they might need to get, like you say, they either need to get more tools or they need to become good at using those tools. So I often say, right, your homework is this, or your homework is that, or whatever it might be. So cricket, I'll say, 100 catches. because next week we're going to be doing a catching game. So 100 catches, come back and say, right, did you do your homework? All right, well, let's see. Because I want them to, they need to have lots of goes, don't they? Lots of goes. You can't always give them lots of goes because I've got 40 or 50 of them to contend with, or however many I'm coaching. But when they come to the game, it always has to be, okay, whatever tool you've developed or however refined your tool's going to be, we're going to see how well you can apply that when we've got some layers of pressure involved, because that's skill.
Yeah, I agree. And the issue with the game is you can't get the repetition. Yeah. You might get that one go, and when you do get that one go, you've got to feel pretty comfortable that you know what to focus on in order to reproduce that technique. No, I agree. With younger ones, I've taken the approach of, well, let's play then, and let's have a little think about. I did this with a group recently, 2 years ago, who were really average performers. And the reason they came training was they wanted to have fun. And nobody mentioned anything about they wanted to get better, and except one kid. So I just made sure they had fun when they came training. And then it was basically, I didn't do anything that wasn't opposed. Mm-hmm. Okay. And essentially we played lots of little games and versions of games, with overloads or whatever, that always had a shot at the end of it. So I put 2 sticks in, 2 goals. We didn't have any goalies because nobody wanted to play in goal. So I introduced the idea of a rush goalie that I grew up with. Yeah. Anyone could be the goalie when you defended, but you came out to attack. And so they handled that one quite well. But their idea of fun was just having a shot at goal. Yeah. I did that. And then sometimes I say, well, if you want to get better, how about we spend 10 minutes and I'll try and help you with your shooting technique. I'll show you how to maybe strike the ball a little bit better. And they would buy into that because it was related to their idea of having fun. It was, we're going to have more fun now because we're going to get more shots. Yeah. But we had the equipment, we had enough balls, and so we didn't have to keep running down the road to get the balls, I'd put one on the other side and one would go in goal, and they'd take it in turns, and the guy on the other side would stop the ball and have a shot back. And so it was kind of in a way going from the game into a bit of technique practice, and then back into the game again and say, well, come on, the whole bit, I guess you'd say, as an approach. Yeah. So it's
we're in violent agreement, Ron.
Yeah, I think so. Going with older players, the other thing I think I said in the beginning, Stu, that there's a danger of sort of applying something and going right across football. Yeah. The analogy I had with driving a car, I've always tried to coach players about very simple strategies. And what do you look for? What tells you? I mean, the game, and I've used this term a lot recently, the game is about going from here to there. Mm. So whenever you win the ball, unless you're within shooting range, the idea is you actually move the ball and players in a forward direction, so you can get close enough to score. So I've tried to apply that in practice. So whatever we do, when we win it, we've got to get players and the ball further up, unless we're in shooting range already, Yeah. And I've tried to use that. So it's very much about cue recognition in terms of, well, can I get in behind my opponent? If I think about that, and so first of all, do I know where he is? So my starting point of teaching football with decent performers, now lads that have got decent technique and are playing at a reasonable standard, my starting point with them is always to say, do you know where your marker is? Yeah. And you get in a position then where you can see who's marking you and the ball. And I've even had kids running around saying, where's my man, where's the ball? To make them, and then when they say, where's my man, they have to look at him. And what that does is it actually puts them, and it spreads them out, and it puts them in good positions where they're not only going to see the man, but invariably they can actually see in a forward direction. Yeah. And so they are in far fewer positions where they have their back to goal. Yeah. And so you cover a multitude of sins. So I've tried to work very hard at coming up with a term that covers an awful lot of things that you might want to kind of like talk about or explain, but you don't have to, because that one thing covers a multitude of things that are desirable.
Yeah.
Like, being able to see opponents, being half turned, being able to play the ball forwards with your first touch, or being able to just take your first touch and go beyond the next line of defence. And I've found that to be a really good starting point. And I also use it as a gauge to see what the level of thinking is of players in the game.
Yeah.
So for me, players who really are not thinking are players who are in good positions, and then they run towards the ball often where they can't see a defender and they want to pass. And 9 times out of 10, they either give it back to the bloke who just gave it to them, or they try and turn and get smashed because they don't know where the defenders are. And you say to yourself, well, for me, that's a clear sign that this player is not thinking, other than, I want the ball.
Yeah.
And so I've got a number of other different things that people do off the ball, because when you think about it, Stu, I know techniques are critical to the game, but you spend most of the game actually not with the ball.
Yeah.
But how much time do we spend? A proportionate amount of time coaching to try and help people understand what they should look for and what are they going to try and do? Because that leads us into what we were talking about on Twitter about making things automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the techniques become the automatic bit that you don't think about anymore. You just do them. So if I see I'm in a good position, I say, cool, if I get the ball in here, I could play that first time if Stewie makes a run. And he knows that I know I can see him. So he ought to anticipate now that if I get a ball played to me, he makes a run, I'm going to see it, I'm going to play him in.
Yeah.
But I don't think about my techniques. My thinking now is completely on a strategic level. And I think that is, kind of like at the other end of the spectrum when it comes to performance.
Yeah.
So how do you learn these things, I guess?
I've had a blog post I've been trying to write and publish for a long time, and it's saying I don't think we want technicians. I think we want technicians. So what we want is
I like it.
Yeah. So it's people who choose actions in the game in relation to whatever their objective is at that moment in time. And they understand that the action they're choosing or the move they're making is related to that. So there's always a decision. And my biggest issue with the kind of obsession with technique is that we lose that. And so what you've got is lots and lots of players who are, we talk about, say, in England often we say we're just not as technically adept as other nations like Spain or whatever. And I don't agree. I don't think we are technically adept. The problem is that we can't apply our technique effectively. We're not good decision makers. That's the fundamental difference. And so for me, kind of what you're talking about there, I mean, I have a slightly different take on the automatic thing, because I'm not 100% sure whether it needs to be automatic or it's just really, really adaptable. I know what you mean when you say automatic. It's almost like it doesn't require a lot of conscious processing, and I get that. But I think what a lot of people assume is that to do something, for something to be automatic, it means that you don't have to, that you practice it a lot and you do a lot of repetition, sort of this almost mindless repetition for it to become automatic. And I don't agree with that. I actually think you want mindful repetition because you want it to be automatic in relation to the context that you're seeing.
Yeah. Well, I think that over years of actually performing techniques on a regular basis, that's what I mean, is that I never think about how hard I'm going to kick a football or how I'm going to kick it. If I want to just dink one to the far post, it's a question of saying, where do you want it? Oh, I need to put it there, and bang. you either can do it or you can't. And I've got no idea how hard you would kick the ball. I couldn't describe to you what I've just done, other than say I've chipped it or I've driven it, or I've pinged one in towards the near post for someone, to get a volley. But it's only through all of the repetition over years that you can either do that or you can't. And in that learning stages, I think that's where, coaches have a chance to work with players and say, well, looking at what you're doing here, let the ball come a little bit closer to your body. I think you're striking it too soon, and that's why you're a bit erratic. Because sometimes you're striking the ball when your leg is fully extended, and now you've lost the ability to actually go through the ball. If you let the ball come in closer, maybe then you start to say, well, if you can, let it come level with your non-kicking foot, or think about it coming past your non-kicking foot, because now you're in a strike zone and you can chip it, you can hit it with the inside of your foot. So from the same position, you can actually perform, 3 or 4 different kind of ball flights. So for me, that's where coaching can help. Get someone's attention to, well, where am I going wrong? I've been out here and I'm still no better than when I started. I'm still erratic. So I can get all 4 techniques, but I don't know how to get the one that I want.
So the approach I would take with that is, in order to do what you just described there with the refinements, is I would take a slightly different tack, which is I would try and get the player to become more aware of the actions they're making. And the way I would do that is that I would just draw attention to it. So I would use a question, I suppose, to draw attention to it. But then what I might then do is I might manipulate wherever the pass needs to go. I would manipulate the distance or the direction that needs to go in, and ask them to sort of report back to me what they notice about the difference. And then they would probably say, hopefully, all the things you've just said to me. Well, I've noticed that I've sort of let it come across my body a little bit more in order to, that's interesting. Okay, have another go at that then. Let's see how we get on. So I try and get the player sort of tapped into, or draw their awareness of the certain actions that I sort of, they might need to, but let them explore the differences, because it goes back to your point earlier, when you said about doing that free kick and you worked it out for yourself. That's a powerful learning moment. And so what I'm trying to do is to take myself out of that as the coach, in terms of giving the answer, and almost say, let's just pay attention to this and see what you can come up with. Yeah,
that's fair enough. I'm just sitting here thinking about that. I would often use the term, I would say to players, what did that feel like? You feel that, you're balanced, you're not reaching for it, or, and then what I'd finish up doing with something like that, I'd get someone to play a ball out, and then say, right, you've got to call what's going now. So as they're coming in to strike it, they're going to go, far post. And if they drill one to the near post, we know they haven't actually, produced what they wanted. So it wasn't like saying, well, let's see what happens here. And then we'll say, that was a good one to the far post. But they're deep down inside, they're saying, well, I meant to put that in the near post region, but I've miskicked it. But I accept what you're saying there, Stu. And that's just, I guess it's a time. And that also makes me question sometimes, you see, about interference in the game. If you ask a lot of questions, it's going to take time. And I'm not saying that you just go in and jump right in and say, right, do this or whatever. But I've always taken the kind of approach that if I'm going to intervene with something or ask a question, it'll be, can you tell me what was it that made you pass the ball there? What were you seeing? As opposed to something else. And they might say, well, I thought he was going. Okay, fine. Play on. Because I'm interested. I'm sure you've been as a coach, you'll be watching activity and you go, I wonder why he played that. Or it was on to do so-and-so. They haven't seen it, And so obviously the player, now first of all, he's got a totally different view, but he's also, he's making a decision about something that you maybe didn't even consider, because you thought, hey, if he just played it so-and-so, we could have scored then.
Yeah.
For example, so I'm really interested in what is it that players see that influence their decision making.
Yeah.
And I would often investigate that with players after the game.
Yeah.
And say, hey, do you remember when so-and-so gave you the ball on the edge of the box and you did this? Can you remember the situation? What was going through your mind? Why did you do that? Can you remember it? And sometimes I might go, no, I can't remember it. I say, okay, we'll try and set it up tomorrow at training, and recreate the situation.
Yeah.
And often I'd say to players, we often took the approach with the boys, if you're never sure about what to do in a game, try and keep that moment in your mind and we'll set it up at training. Yeah. And that used to be a regular occurrence. Lads would go, I want to talk to you after, might be after the game. I've got something happened tonight in the game. I wasn't sure what to do.
Yeah.
And I go, okay, just tomorrow then we'll recreate and we'll look at what the possibilities are and you'll work out yourself what the right answer is.
Yeah, that's
and sometimes they say to me, what should I do? And I'll say, well, do you know what? I can't give you an answer at the moment because I need a bit of time to think about that.
Yeah.
I'll give you my answer tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then I go and think about the principles of play.
Yeah.
Because for me, the whole game is based on the principles and it guides your thinking to actually either create or solve a problem.
Yeah.
In the end, I do believe firmly that what you're perceiving is what aligned with some tactical awareness. My attitude as a coach with good players was, if you can score, do it.
Yeah.
If you can't score, try and give it to someone who can.
Yeah.
And the thing you look for when you get the ball is, can I give the ball to someone who can score? And I don't care where you are on the pitch. So, if we're all too far away to score or giving it to someone who can score, when we've got to keep the ball long enough to try and move up the park so someone can score. That was it in a nutshell. So that guided all of your kind of decision making about what are we trying to do here.
Yeah.
I could talk to you for hours, Stu, because
yeah, I'm conscious that it's getting late at your side. I'm just getting towards just getting up to lunch at this time. And I like you, Ron. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we could go on for more, and no doubt we will have to reconvene this conversation and take it further. But in the interests of letting you get to bed, where can people find out more about you and what you talk about and all those sorts of things?
Well, actually, some years ago now, I created my website, which is called The Football Centre. Okay, .com.au. And I've tried to share my views about coaching and what I've found to be very useful in terms of planning, putting sessions together. It's not one of those websites where you've got 1,000 sessions for this, that and the other. Quite the opposite. It's almost like doing a kind of a mini coaching course. I've got some presentations on there where I talk about what to teach players, and so on. I've got, the 7 habits of highly effective players. And essentially what I've done with that is to show behaviour. I'm very much in terms of teaching behaviour. And I've got examples of players from 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and last week with the same behaviours. And so if people want to take some ownership of their development, there are a number of things that you can actually focus on and practice in any training session that is not going to be anything against whatever the coach is doing. There are times when you're playing games and you can actually focus on your position on what you look at on the field. And I'm a big believer in focusing on what you can control. I spent 10 years working very closely with a good sports psychologist. And he always used to say to us, don't worry about things that are beyond your control. Focus on what you can. and I can face a defender and he can't stop me. So I'm in control of how I position my body on the field and what I look at. Nobody can stop me from doing that.
Yeah.
And that can provide a massive advantage if you know what to look for. So, it's that sort of stuff. And, my views generally on what I believe in terms of player development and working with, people at all levels of the game, that sort of thing. So it's very much a kind of an educational type website.
Yeah, and it's written. Having listened to you speak at a conference last year, it's rich with lots of information. You go quite heavy onto the data side of things and the analytics side of things as well, looking at the game from a kind of numbers perspective, but trying to make sense of it by using statistics as a measure, which I think is really fascinating as well.
Yeah.
So I'd highly recommend listeners to dig in there. There's a wealth of knowledge. I've stolen stuff off there to apply in the work I do with hockey, because basically they're the same game, just use a stick instead of a foot. Brilliant. And also on Twitter, you are at smudger_RS, aren't you? Is that right?
That's right, with a capital S. Yeah.
And prolific on there as well. So I used to think I tweeted a lot.
If I'm not analysing games, which I seem to be doing most days of the week, I enjoy. And I've explored a number of things through contacts on Twitter. I mean, that's how I first met you, Stu.
Yeah.
But I've been reading and listening to some really interesting podcasts this week about the constraints-led approach to coaching. We could talk about that for another hour. But I've actually listened to Rob Gray from Arizona State University.
Rob's great.
And he's got some really interesting views about constraints-led approaches. And he's also saying that you've got to be very careful about your expectations, because it's not sort of been around that long. And there's a lot of research still to be done to see what the long-term effects are and stuff like that. But I've found that really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah. That's definitely one we'll dig into on part 2.
Okay. All right. I look forward to that, Stu.
Ron, it's been great to chat to you.
Thanks very much, and keep up the good work. I've enjoyed listening to other people that you've interviewed, and I look forward to many more of them.
I appreciate that, Ron, and this is a really valuable contribution that you've made here in the run-up to Christmas, so I appreciate your time.
Right, okay, no worries.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye.
So there you have it. A really great conversation with Ron. Really enjoyed talking to him. We were having quite a debate on Twitter, and it just goes to show that when you can sort of actually have a proper conversation with somebody, sometimes Twitter doesn't help to get across those key points. So, I'm really appreciative. It's not every day you get somebody with Ron's wealth of experience and get an opportunity to talk to them about things that we so passionate about, and coaching and supporting young people to develop. I do love this idea that he's moving away from the rondo, looking to do things much more directionally, trying to make it much more representative. And what's really interesting is also just how we have to be really clear about terminology and what it is we're trying to do with the development of young players. Also wanted to say a massive thank you to all the people who've taken the trouble to go over and join the Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. Quite a lot of people have joined the conclave, the mastermind groups that I'm running. They're completely full already, sold out within about 3 or 4 days. So massively appreciative of everybody's support as far as that's concerned. May have to look at opening up another couple if there's enough demand. Please give me an email if you're interested in that. Also, a big shout out and a big fist bump because there's a couple of all-round good eggs who've joined just as supporters. They've not joined the conclave; they've just been supporters, essentially buying me a cup of coffee. Fraser Reynolds and Adam Hanover, you guys are awesome. Thank you for supporting the podcast, and hope to keep good stuff coming to you over the next few weeks. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and see you next week.